It was a Tuesday morning, and Mrs. Rodriguez was setting up her third-grade classroom like she did every day. She'd been teaching for 12 years now, and she thought she'd seen everything. But there was something about this school year that felt different, something she couldn't quite put her finger on yet. The kids started filing in around 8:15, their backpacks bouncing, their voices filling the room with that special kind of chaos only 8-year-olds can create. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled and greeted each one by name. She believed in making every child feel seen, feel important. It was something her own teacher had done for her when she was young, and she never forgot it. Among the students was a quiet boy named Tommy. He wasn't the loudest kid in class, but he wasn't the shyest either. He had this way of blending in, of being present but not really noticed. He'd answer questions when called on, do his work without complaint, and keep to himself during free time. A perfectly average student, or so it seemed. But Mrs. Rodriguez was starting to notice things. Little things at first. The kind of details that most people might miss if they weren't paying attention. And Mrs. Rodriguez was always paying attention. It started during lunch period. The cafeteria was the usual madhouse of kids trading snacks, complaining about vegetables, and laughing so hard that milk came out of their noses. Mrs. Rodriguez had lunch duty that week, which meant walking around the tables, reminding kids to actually eat their food instead of building sculptures out of it. That's when she saw Tommy sitting at the end of a table, a book propped open in front of him. He wasn't eating. His lunch tray was nowhere to be seen. When she walked closer, she noticed he didn't even have a lunchbox or paper bag. Nothing. "Tommy, sweetheart, where's your lunch?" she asked gently, crouching down beside him. He didn't look up from his book. "Forgot it at home, Mrs. Rodriguez." "Oh no. Do you want me to call your mom to bring it?" "No, it's okay. I'm not that hungry anyway." She watched him for a moment. His eyes were moving across the page, but she had a feeling he wasn't really reading. It was more like he was hiding behind the book, using it as a shield so nobody would notice he didn't have food. Mrs. Rodriguez went to the cafeteria staff and bought Tommy a school lunch with her own money. When she brought it to him, his eyes lit up for just a second before he tried to look casual about it. "The cafeteria had an extra today," she said, setting the tray down. "They were just going to throw it away, so I figured you could help them out." "Thank you," he mumbled, and then he ate. Not like a normal kid eats, picking at things they don't like and trading away the vegetables. He ate everything. Every single thing on that tray disappeared in less than 10 minutes. Mrs. Rodriguez told herself it was just a one-time thing. Kids forget their lunch sometimes. Parents oversleep, mornings get rushed, things happen. She didn't think much more about it that day. But then Wednesday came and Tommy didn't have lunch again. Same story, same book propped in front of him, same quiet voice saying he forgot it at home. Mrs. Rodriguez bought him lunch again, gave him the same story about the cafeteria having extras. Thursday, no lunch. She bought him one Friday, no lunch. She bought him one. By the following Monday, Mrs. Rodriguez knew this wasn't about forgotten lunches. Something else was going on, something bigger. She started watching Tommy more carefully, not in an obvious way, but with the kind of attention that comes from years of working with children and learning to read the signs they don't know they're showing. She noticed his clothes were always clean, which meant someone at home cared enough to do laundry. But they were also worn thin, faded from too many washes, a little too small for his growing body. His shoes had holes in them that he tried to hide by walking a certain way. His hair was neatly combed, but he wore the same 3 shirts in rotation, week after week. During class, she started noticing other things too. Around 10:30 every morning, Tommy would lose focus. He'd stare out the window or put his head down on his desk. At first, she thought maybe he wasn't getting enough sleep. But then she heard it, a low rumble, quiet but unmistakable. His stomach was growling. It broke her heart. This little boy was sitting in her classroom, trying to learn about multiplication and reading comprehension. But his body was fighting against him. How could anyone concentrate on education when they were hungry? Mrs. Rodriguez started keeping granola bars in her desk drawer. When she saw Tommy looking particularly tired or unfocused, she'd walk by his desk and quietly slip one onto it. "I packed too many snacks today," she'd say with a casual smile. "Help me out?" Tommy would take them, and she'd see his shoulders relax just a little bit. Those granola bars became a routine. Sometimes she'd give him 2, claiming her husband had packed her lunch too full. Tommy never questioned it, and she never made a big deal out of it. But the lunches were a bigger problem. Every day Tommy came to school without food. Every day Mrs. Rodriguez had to come up with a new story about why she happened to have an extra lunch available. She was running out of excuses, and more importantly, she was spending $75 to $100 a week of her own money to feed one student. She didn't mind the money, not really. She'd go without if it meant Tommy got to eat. But she knew this wasn't sustainable, and she knew there had to be a better way. One afternoon, after the kids had gone home, Mrs. Rodriguez sat at her desk and just thought about Tommy's situation. She wondered about his home life, about what was happening there. Was it neglect? Was it poverty? Was there abuse involved? She felt helpless, frustrated that she couldn't do more, that she couldn't fix whatever was broken in this child's life. She decided to reach out to the school counselor, Ms. Patterson, who had been at the school even longer than she had. Maybe Ms. Patterson would know what to do, know what resources were available. The next morning, before classes started, Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on Ms. Patterson's office door. They sat down with coffee, and Mrs. Rodriguez explained everything she'd noticed about Tommy. The missing lunches, the worn clothes, the hunger that was so obvious if you just looked. Ms. Patterson listened carefully, nodding along, her face serious. When Mrs. Rodriguez finished, Ms. Patterson pulled out a file from her cabinet. Tommy's file. His grandmother has custody, Ms. Patterson explained quietly. His mother left when he was 5. Dad's in prison. Grandmother is doing her absolute best, but she's working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. They're barely making it. Mrs. Rodriguez felt tears prick at her eyes. So he's coming to school hungry every single day. I'm afraid so. Grandmother knows about the free lunch program, but there's paperwork. There's waiting periods, there's bureaucracy. She applied 3 weeks ago. Still waiting for approval. 3 weeks? Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't keep the frustration out of her voice. He can't wait 3 weeks. He needs food now. The 2 women sat in silence for a moment, both feeling the weight of a problem that was bigger than either of them. This wasn't just about Tommy. They both knew that. In a school of 400 kids, how many others were going hungry? How many other children were sitting in classrooms with empty stomachs, trying to learn, trying to grow, trying to just be kids when their basic needs weren't being met? Mrs. Rodriguez went back to her classroom that morning with a heavy heart, but also with a determination starting to form in her mind. She couldn't fix poverty. She couldn't change Tommy's family situation. She couldn't speed up bureaucracy. But she could do something. She had to do something. She just didn't know what yet. That day at lunch, she watched Tommy eat the meal she'd bought him, and she made a decision. She was going to figure out a way to help. Not just Tommy, but any kid in her classroom who needed it. She didn't know how, and she didn't know if it would work, but she knew she had to try, because that's what teachers do. They don't just teach reading and math. They show up for their students in ways that matter, in ways that last long after the school year ends. And Mrs. Rodriguez was about to show up in a way she never imagined. Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't stop thinking about Tommy. Even at home, while she was cooking dinner or watching television with her husband, her mind kept drifting back to that little boy sitting in her classroom with an empty stomach. She found herself lying awake at night staring at the ceiling, turning the problem over and over in her head. Her husband, David, noticed something was bothering her. One evening, as they sat at their kitchen table eating leftover pasta, he finally asked what was wrong. She told him everything. About Tommy, about the missing lunches, about the grandmother working 2 jobs and still not being able to make ends meet. David listened quietly, the way he always did when she needed to talk about her students. After 12 years of marriage, he'd learned that teaching wasn't just her job. It was who she was. These kids weren't just names on a roster. They were her kids, and their problems became her problems. So what are you going to do? He asked. I don't know yet, she admitted, but I can't just keep buying him lunch every day and pretending everything is fine. It's not fine. And I keep thinking, if Tommy is hungry, how many other kids are going through the same thing? David reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You'll figure something out. You always do. The next day at school, Mrs. Rodriguez decided to do some detective work. Not in an obvious way, but quietly, carefully. She started paying closer attention during lunch period. She watched which kids ate eagerly and which ones picked at their food. She noticed who had packed lunches from home and who bought school meals. She saw which students traded snacks with friends and which ones sat alone empty-handed. What she discovered made her stomach turn. Tommy wasn't alone. There was a girl named Lily who always claimed she'd eaten a big breakfast and wasn't hungry at lunch. There was a boy named Kevin who would stuff napkins in his pockets from the cafeteria. When Mrs. Rodriguez asked him about it once, he said his mom needed them at home, but she suspected he was taking them because napkins were something. Anything to have in his pockets when other kids had food. Another student, a girl named Rachel, would volunteer to help clean up the cafeteria after lunch. Mrs. Rodriguez watched one day and saw Rachel quietly eating the leftovers from other kids' trays while she cleared the tables. Nobody seemed to notice except Mrs. Rodriguez, who felt like someone had reached into her chest and squeezed her heart. 4 children. 4 children in her classroom alone were coming to school hungry, and those were just the ones she'd identified. There might be more who were better at hiding it. She scheduled a meeting with the principal, Mr. Hayes. He was a good man, someone who genuinely cared about the students. But he was also bound by budgets and policies, and 1,000 other constraints that came with running a school. Mrs. Rodriguez laid out what she'd observed. She showed him her own receipts from buying lunches for Tommy. She explained her concerns about the other students. Mr. Hayes listened, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. The free and reduced lunch program should be catching these kids, and he said, rubbing his temples. But the paperwork takes time, and some families don't even know it exists. Others are too proud to apply. And then there are kids who fall right in that gap where their parents make just slightly too much to qualify, but not enough to actually afford regular meals. So what can we do? Mrs. Rodriguez asked. Officially, my hands are tied. The district has strict policies about food distribution, liability issues, health codes. I can't just let teachers start feeding students out of their own pockets even though I know that's what's happening. He paused, looking at her with understanding in his eyes. Unofficially, if a teacher wants to keep some snacks in their classroom for emergencies, well, that's their personal choice. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was something. Mrs. Rodriguez thanked him and left his office with the wheels in her mind turning even faster. That night she went to the grocery store. She filled her cart with granola bars, crackers, peanut butter, fruit cups, juice boxes, everything non-perishable she could think of. The cashier rang up her order and the total came to $167. Mrs. Rodriguez swiped her credit card without hesitation. David helped her carry the bags from the car. That's a lot of snacks, he said, eyeing the mountain of food now covering their kitchen counter. It's a start, she replied. The next morning, Mrs. Rodriguez came to school an hour early. She had a small closet in her classroom, the kind that usually held extra textbooks and art supplies. She cleared it out and started stocking it with all the food she'd bought. She arranged everything neatly on the shelves, boxes of crackers here, granola bars there, fruit cups in neat rows. When she was done, she stood back and looked at her work. It wasn't much. This small closet of food would probably last a week, maybe 2 if she was lucky. But it was something. It was a way to help without making any child feel singled out or embarrassed. She made a simple sign on her computer, printed it out, and taped it to the inside of the closet door. Take what you need. No questions asked. That morning, before the students arrived, she thought about how to introduce this to her class. She didn't want to make a big announcement. That would draw too much attention to the kids who needed it. She needed to make it seem normal, casual, like it had always been there. When the kids filed in, chattering and loud as always, Mrs. Rodriguez waited until they'd settled into their seats. Then she said in the most matter-of-fact voice she could manage, "Hey everyone, I set up a snack station in the closet over there. If any of you get hungry during the day, you're welcome to grab something. Just try to take only what you'll eat so there's enough for everyone." Some kids looked curious. A few got up immediately to check it out. Most just shrugged and went back to pulling out their homework. Perfect. That was exactly the reaction she wanted. Nothing special, nothing weird, just a thing that existed in their classroom now. Tommy didn't get up right away. He glanced at the closet, then at Mrs. Rodriguez, then back at his desk. She caught his eye and gave him a small smile. He understood. At lunch that day, for the first time in weeks, Mrs. Rodriguez didn't have to buy Tommy a meal. Before they'd gone to the cafeteria, she'd seen him quietly slip over to the closet and put a granola bar and a juice box in his backpack. During lunch, while other kids ate their hot meals, Tommy ate his granola bar and drank his juice. It wasn't much, but he wasn't sitting there with nothing. He wasn't hiding behind a book, pretending he wasn't hungry. Lily, the girl who always claimed she'd eaten a big breakfast, also visited the closet that morning. So did Kevin and Rachel. They didn't take much, just enough to get them through the day, and nobody made fun of them. Nobody pointed or whispered. Because several other kids who weren't hungry but just wanted a snack, also grabbed things from the closet throughout the day. It blended in. It was normal. That first week, Mrs. Rodriguez watched the closet carefully. She saw who took what and how often. She restocked it twice, spending another $100 of her own money each time. She didn't mind. Seeing Tommy actually eat during lunch, seeing the relief on these kids' faces when they knew they could grab a snack if they needed one, that was worth every penny. But she also knew this couldn't continue forever. She was spending between $300 and $400 a week now. Her teacher's salary wasn't huge to begin with, and while she and David were comfortable, they weren't wealthy. She had student loans, a mortgage, car payments. She couldn't sustain this alone. One afternoon after school had let out, Mrs. Rodriguez sat in her empty classroom and stared at her laptop screen. She'd opened Facebook, something she usually only used to keep up with old college friends and share pictures of her dog. But now she was looking at it differently, thinking about it differently. What if she just told people what was happening? What if she was honest about child hunger, about what she was seeing in her own classroom? Would people care? Would they help? She thought about Tommy and Lily and Kevin and Rachel. She thought about their dignity, about their privacy. She couldn't share their names or their stories without permission, but she could share her own story. She could talk about what she was doing and why. Mrs. Rodriguez started typing. She wrote about being a teacher and discovering that students in her classroom were coming to school hungry. She didn't use names. She didn't identify anyone. She just spoke from her heart about what it felt like to watch children try to learn when their stomachs were empty. About the small snack closet she'd started in her classroom. About her hope that maybe other teachers could do the same thing. She attached a photo of the closet. Shelves neatly stocked with food, her simple sign visible. Take what you need. No questions asked. Her finger hovered over the post button. This felt vulnerable, putting herself out there like this. What if people criticized her? What if they said she was overstepping, that it wasn't her job to feed students, that parents should be responsible? But then she thought about Tommy's face when he ate that cafeteria lunch she'd bought him. The way his whole body had relaxed. The way he'd eaten every single thing on the tray. She thought about how education and nutrition were connected, how a child can't learn if they're hungry. She clicked post. Then she closed her laptop, packed up her things, and went home. She didn't check Facebook again that night. She had no idea what kind of response, if any, her post would get. She just knew she'd done what felt right, what felt true. The next morning, Mrs. Rodriguez woke up to find her phone buzzing nonstop with notifications. Her post had been shared a lot. She'd gone to bed with maybe 200 Facebook friends. Now her post had thousands of reactions and hundreds of shares. People she'd never met were commenting, saying they had no idea child hunger was such a problem, asking how they could help, sharing similar stories from their own communities. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in her bed, still in her pajamas, reading comment after comment, tears streaming down her face. She'd just wanted to feed a few kids in her classroom. She had no idea she was about to start something much bigger. Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't believe what was happening. By the time she got to school that morning, her Facebook post had been shared over 50,000 times. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from people she hadn't talked to in years, from complete strangers, from other teachers across the country saying they wanted to start something similar in their own classrooms. She had to turn her phone on silent during class because it wouldn't stop going off. The students noticed something was different about her that day. She seemed distracted, kept checking her phone between lessons, had this look on her face like she'd just witnessed something incredible but couldn't quite process it yet. At lunch, while the kids were in the cafeteria, Mrs. Rodriguez finally sat down and scrolled through the comments on her post. There were thousands of them now. Parents thanking her for bringing attention to the issue. Teachers sharing their own stories about hungry students. People asking if they could send donations, wanting to know where to mail gift cards or supplies. One comment in particular caught her attention. It was from another teacher in California who'd written, "I started a snack closet in my classroom today because of your post. Already had 3 kids use it. Thank you for showing us we can do something. That comment made Mrs. Rodriguez cry right there in her empty classroom. She wasn't alone in this anymore. Other teachers were joining in, creating their own safe spaces for hungry kids. The idea was spreading, but with all the attention came questions she hadn't anticipated. People wanted specifics. How much did it cost to maintain the snack closet? What kinds of food worked best? How did she handle students who might take advantage? How did she keep it discreet so kids didn't feel embarrassed? Mrs. Rodriguez spent her planning period that afternoon writing a follow-up post, answering these questions. She explained that she spent about $100 a week to keep it stocked. She listed the foods that worked best, ones that were non-perishable, nutritious, and didn't require refrigeration. She talked about the importance of making it available to all students, not just the ones who seemed hungry, so nobody felt singled out. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, teachers from all 50 states were commenting that they'd started or were planning to start similar programs. Some called them snack closets, others called them sharing shelves or kindness pantries. The names varied, but the purpose was the same. Then came the donations. Mrs. Rodriguez had mentioned in her post that she was funding the closet herself, not as a complaint, just as a fact. She hadn't asked for money or help, but people started sending it anyway. The first envelope arrived 2 days after her post went viral. It was addressed to her classroom, and inside was a $50 gift card to a local grocery store with a note that said, "Thank you for feeding our future. Use this to keep your snack closet full." Mrs. Rodriguez held that gift card and cried. Again. She was doing a lot of crying these days, but they were good tears, grateful tears. More envelopes started arriving. Gift cards, checks, handwritten notes of encouragement. A retired teacher from Florida sent a $100 check with a letter explaining that she'd taught for 40 years and had always wished she'd done something like this. A parent from Texas sent an Amazon gift card for $200, saying their own child had gone hungry as a kid and they never wanted another child to experience that. Within a week, Mrs. Rodriguez had received over $3,000 in donations. She was stunned. She set up a box in the school office where they could collect the mail because her classroom was getting overwhelmed. Mr. Hayes, the principal, called her into his office. She walked in nervously, wondering if she was in trouble. After all, this had gotten way bigger than anyone expected, and schools don't always like unexpected attention. But Mr. Hayes was smiling. "Do you have any idea what you've started?" he asked. "I'm starting to get a sense of it," she admitted. "I've had calls from the district office, from the local news, from parents wanting to volunteer. Everyone wants to know about this snack closet." He leaned back in his chair. "I've also had 3 other teachers in this building ask if they can start their own. What do you think about that?" Mrs. Rodriguez felt her heart swell. "I think that would be amazing. I thought you'd say that. So here's what I'm proposing. What if we made this a school-wide program? We set up food stations in multiple classrooms, maybe 1 per grade level. We use the donations you've been getting to stock them. We make it official, get parent volunteers involved, maybe even apply for grants. Turn this into something sustainable." It was everything Mrs. Rodriguez had hoped for but hadn't dared to imagine. "Yes," she said immediately. "Absolutely yes." Over the next 2 weeks, Lincoln Elementary School transformed. 5 teachers, including Mrs. Rodriguez, set up snack stations in their classrooms. Parent volunteers organized the donations that kept pouring in. Someone donated a storage cabinet that they put in the teacher's lounge, filling it with bulk supplies. The local news did a story about it. Mrs. Rodriguez gave an interview, talking about why this mattered, why no child should have to sit in a classroom hungry. The segment aired during the evening news, and the next day local businesses started calling. A grocery store chain offered to donate $50 worth of food each week. A wholesale club gave them a membership and committed to monthly donations. A local bakery said they'd bring their day-old bread and pastries every Friday. The support kept growing, but the most important thing, the thing that mattered more than all the donations and news coverage, was what was happening with the students. Mrs. Rodriguez watched Tommy carefully over those weeks. He still visited the snack closet regularly, but something had changed in him. He smiled more. He participated more in class. His grades started improving. One day, about 3 weeks after the post had gone viral, Tommy stayed after class to help Mrs. Rodriguez organize the snack closet. She hadn't asked him to, he'd just volunteered. As they worked together, restocking shelves and checking expiration dates, Tommy said something that made her freeze. Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for doing this. She looked at him. This small 8-year-old boy who'd been carrying the weight of hunger on his shoulders. You're welcome, sweetheart. My grandma says you're an angel, he continued, carefully lining up juice boxes. She was really worried about me about not having enough food. But now I can eat at school and she doesn't have to worry as much. Mrs. Rodriguez had to turn away for a moment to collect herself. Your grandma is doing an amazing job taking care of you, she said when she could trust her voice again. And you're not alone, okay? Lots of kids need a little extra help sometimes. That's what this is for. Tommy nodded seriously. Then he said something that would stick with Mrs. Rodriguez for the rest of her teaching career. When I grow up, I want to help kids like me, so they don't have to be hungry either. That evening, Mrs. Rodriguez shared that conversation with David. They were sitting on their couch, her laptop open as she read through more messages from teachers wanting to start similar programs. You know what's crazy? She said. I just wanted to help one kid, Tommy. That's all I was trying to do, and somehow it became this whole movement. David smiled at her. That's how change happens, though, isn't it? One person sees a problem and decides to do something about it. Then other people see what they're doing and join in. Before you know it, thousands of kids are being fed because you couldn't stand to watch one little boy go hungry. She thought about that, about how she'd been lying awake at night just a month ago, feeling helpless and frustrated. About the first time she'd bought Tommy lunch and made up that story about the cafeteria having extras. About the moment she'd decided to set up that small closet in her classroom. None of it had been planned. She hadn't set out to start a viral movement or get on the news or inspire teachers across the country. She just wanted to feed a hungry child. But sometimes that's enough. Sometimes one small act of kindness, one person refusing to look away from a problem, is all it takes to change everything. Her laptop pinged with a new email. It was from a teacher in Oregon who'd just set up a snack closet in her classroom. The email included a photo, a small closet stocked with food, and a handmade sign that said, "Take what you need. No questions asked." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. The message was spreading, multiplying, reaching places she'd never been and probably never would go. But her idea was there, helping kids she'd never meet. Teachers she didn't know were feeding students who were hungry, creating safe spaces where no child had to feel ashamed or embarrassed about needing food. She'd started something real, something important, something that was making a difference in ways she was only beginning to understand. The next morning at school, Mrs. Rodriguez noticed something new. Other teachers had started decorating their snack stations. Mrs. Patterson, who taught 5th grade, had painted her cabinet with bright colors and positive messages. Mr. Thompson, the 2nd grade teacher, had let his students decorate his with handprints and their names. Each classroom was making it their own, but the core idea remained the same. Food, freely available, no questions asked. At a staff meeting that week, Mr. Hayes announced that they'd received enough donations to keep the program running for at least 6 months, probably longer. He also shared that 5 other schools in their district were starting similar programs, inspired by what was happening at Lincoln Elementary. I want to thank Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Hayes said, and everyone in the staff room turned to look at her, for reminding us what teaching is really about. It's not just about test scores and curriculum standards. It's about taking care of our students, all of them, in every way they need. The other teachers applauded, and Mrs. Rodriguez felt her cheeks burning. She'd never wanted recognition. She just wanted to help. But she understood what Mr. Hayes was saying. This was about more than food. It was about showing kids that they mattered, that adults in their lives noticed when they were struggling and cared enough to help. After the meeting, several teachers approached her with their own stories. Ms. Chen, who taught kindergarten, shared that she'd noticed one of her students hoarding crackers from snack time, stuffing them in her pockets. Now that student could just take from the snack station instead. Mr. Johnson talked about a boy in his class who'd been falling asleep every afternoon because he was so hungry. Now he grabbed a granola bar before lunch and could stay awake and focused. Each story reinforced what Mrs. Rodriguez already knew. Child hunger wasn't rare. It wasn't something that only happened in other places to other people. It was here, in their school, in their classrooms, affecting children they saw every single day. The difference now was that they were doing something about it. They weren't looking away. They weren't assuming someone else would handle it. They were stepping up, each in their own small way, And together, those small ways were adding up to something significant. Mrs. Rodriguez went home that night feeling lighter than she had in months. The problem hadn't gone away. There were still kids who were hungry, still families struggling to make ends meet. But now there was a solution, at least a partial one. Now there was hope. And sometimes hope is enough to change everything. The morning Mrs. Rodriguez's phone rang with a call from a Los Angeles area code she almost didn't answer. She'd been getting calls all week from reporters wanting to interview her. And honestly, she was getting tired of telling the same story over and over. But something made her pick up. "Hi, is this Mrs. Rodriguez? The teacher with the snack closet program?" "Yes, that's me," she said cautiously. "My name is Patricia Chen, and I'm a producer for Good Morning America. We'd love to have you on the show to talk about what you're doing. Would you be interested?" Mrs. Rodriguez nearly dropped her phone. Good Morning America. National television. Millions of viewers. Her mind raced. This could bring even more attention to child hunger, could inspire even more teachers and schools to take action. But it also felt overwhelming. She was just a third-grade teacher from a small town. She wasn't used to this kind of spotlight. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course. But I should mention, we'd like to do this fairly soon, maybe early next week. The story is really resonating right now, and we think it's important to share while people are paying attention." Mrs. Rodriguez talked it over with David that night. Then she called Mr. Hayes. Then she talked to Tommy's grandmother, because she knew Tommy would probably be mentioned even if she didn't use his name, and she wanted to make sure the family was comfortable with it. Tommy's grandmother, Mrs. Williams, started crying on the phone. "You go on that show," she said firmly. "You tell everyone what you're doing. My Tommy isn't the only hungry child out there, and if you being on TV means more kids get fed, then you do it. You do it and don't think twice." So Mrs. Rodriguez called Patricia back and said yes. The next week was chaos. A camera crew came to the school. They filmed her classroom, the snack closet, interviewed Mr. Hayes and a few other teachers. They were careful not to identify any students by name or show their faces clearly, but they captured the essence of what was happening. Children quietly visiting the snack station, taking what they needed. The simple dignity of it all. The interview itself was done via satellite from a local news station. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in front of a camera, an earpiece in her ear, talking to hosts she could hear but couldn't see. They asked her questions about how this started, about the response, about what she hoped would happen next. "I just think every child deserves to have food," she said, trying to sound calm even though her heart was racing. "We spend so much time talking about test scores and academic achievement, but none of that matters if a kid is sitting in class too hungry to focus. This is basic. This is fundamental. And if we as educators, as a society, can't make sure children have enough to eat, then what are we even doing?" The interview aired 2 days later on a Tuesday morning. Mrs. Rodriguez watched it at home before school, David beside her on the couch. It felt surreal seeing herself on national television, talking about something that had started so simply in her small classroom. Then she went to school, and everything changed again. By lunchtime, the school's main phone line had received over 100 calls, people wanting to donate, wanting to start programs in their own schools, wanting to help. The school's Facebook page was flooded with comments and messages. Mr. Hayes had to assign someone from the office just to handle the incoming communication. Mrs. Rodriguez's email inbox was overflowing. Other teachers from around the world, from Australia, from Canada, from England, were reaching out. They'd seen the segment online and wanted to know how they could replicate the program. A teacher from a small village in Kenya sent a message saying they were gathering donations to start a similar program there, where child hunger was even more severe. The donations started coming in even faster. Checks, gift cards, offers from companies to provide bulk food supplies. A national food bank organization reached out and offered to partner with schools that wanted to set up these programs, providing resources and support. But the most surprising call came 3 days after the Good Morning America segment aired. It was from a woman named Andrea Morrison, who introduced herself as someone interested in nonprofit work. She'd seen the interview, had been following Mrs. Rodriguez's story, and wanted to help take this to the next level. "What you're doing is incredible," Andrea said, "but it's also unsustainable if it's just individual teachers using their own money and hoping for donations. What if we formalize this? Created an actual nonprofit organization dedicated to setting up and supporting these food programs in schools nationwide?" Mrs. Rodriguez was overwhelmed by the idea. I don't know anything about running a nonprofit, she admitted. That's okay. I do. I've helped launch 3 successful nonprofits in the education space. I can handle the business side, the fundraising, the organizational structure, but I need someone like you, someone who understands what's actually happening in classrooms to be the face and heart of this. Would you be interested in partnering with me? It felt like a huge decision. Mrs. Rodriguez asked for time to think, to talk to David, to really consider what this would mean. A nonprofit would be official, structured, permanent. It would mean this wasn't just a viral moment, but a real movement with staying power. She thought about Tommy, about how he'd told her he wanted to help other kids when he grew up. She thought about all the teachers who'd reached out saying they'd started programs in their classrooms. She thought about that teacher in Kenya trying to feed hungry children in her village. She called Andrea back and said yes. Over the next 2 months, while still teaching her class every day, Mrs. Rodriguez worked with Andrea to establish what they decided to call No Empty Desks. The name came from the idea that no desk in any classroom should belong to a child who was hungry. The nonprofit's mission was simple: help schools establish and maintain food programs that ensured every student had access to snacks and meals without stigma or shame. They created a website with resources for teachers who wanted to start programs. They developed partnerships with food banks and grocery chains for bulk donations. They set up a grant system where schools could apply for funding to launch or sustain their programs. They even created a volunteer network where people in local communities could help stock and maintain school food pantries. The response was incredible. Within the first month, over 500 schools registered to join the program. They ranged from tiny rural schools with 50 students to large urban schools with thousands. Each one committed to creating accessible food stations for hungry students. Mrs. Rodriguez started receiving letters, handwritten notes from parents thanking her, emails from students saying the program had changed their lives. One letter from a high school senior explained that she'd been one of those hungry kids in elementary school, and having access to snacks at school had been the difference between dropping out and staying in school. She was now headed to college on a full scholarship. That letter lived in Mrs. Rodriguez's desk drawer, and she read it whenever she felt tired or overwhelmed by the work. But not everything was positive. There were critics, too. Some people accused her of enabling parents who should be taking care of their own children. Others said this was government's responsibility, not schools. A few comments on social media suggested she was doing this for attention or glory. Those criticisms stung, especially late at night when she was exhausted from teaching all day and then working on nonprofit stuff in the evening. But then she'd think about Tommy's face when he could grab a snack from the closet, about the relief in his eyes when he didn't have to hide his hunger anymore. She'd remember Lily and Kevin and Rachel, all those kids who'd been struggling in silence. One particularly nasty comment online said she was just a teacher trying to be a hero. Mrs. Rodriguez read it and felt angry at first. Then she realized something. She wasn't trying to be a hero. Heroes do extraordinary things. She'd just done what anyone should do when they see a child in need. She'd helped. If more people were willing to be heroes in that way, to simply help when they saw someone struggling, maybe the world would be a better place. 6 months after her Facebook post had gone viral, Mrs. Rodriguez was invited to speak at a national education conference. She stood in front of a room full of teachers, administrators, and education policymakers and told them Tommy's story. She still didn't use his real name, but she told them about the little boy who'd come to school hungry every day, about the grandmother working 2 jobs, about the simple snack closet that had started everything. "I didn't do anything special," she said to the crowd. "I just paid attention. I just cared, and then I did something about it. That's all this is. That's all any of us need to do. Pay attention to our students. See them, really see them. Notice when they're struggling. And then instead of assuming someone else will help or that it's not our responsibility, just do something, even if it's small, even if it feels insufficient. Do something." The room erupted in applause. Afterward, dozens of teachers approached her with their own stories, their own ideas, their own commitment to starting programs in their schools. That night, back in her hotel room, Mrs. Rodriguez video called David. "I miss you," she said. "I miss our normal life when I was just a teacher and not this person traveling around giving speeches." "You're still just a teacher," David said gently. "You're just a teacher who decided to feed hungry kids. That's all you've ever been." He was right. At the core of everything, all the media attention and nonprofit work and speaking engagements, she was still Mrs. Rodriguez, third-grade teacher. Every morning, she still went to her classroom. She still taught reading and math. She still gave spelling tests and graded homework. She still had Tommy and 23 other students who needed her to show up and be present and help them learn. The snack closet in her room was always full now, thanks to the nonprofit and the donations and the volunteers. But she still made a point of being there when students visited it. She still smiled at them, still made it feel normal and okay, because that's what mattered, not the national attention or the nonprofit or the speeches. What mattered was that in her classroom, and in hundreds of other classrooms across the country now, children who were hungry had access to food. And they could get it with dignity, without shame, without having to explain or justify their need. It was simple. It was basic. It was just human beings taking care of each other. And somehow, Mrs. Rodriguez had helped make that happen. A year after Mrs. Rodriguez had posted that photo of her snack closet on Facebook, she stood in her classroom early one morning and took stock of how much had changed. The small closet that had started it all was still there, still stocked with food, still serving its quiet purpose. But now it was part of something so much bigger than she'd ever imagined. No empty desks. The nonprofit she'd helped create was now operating in over 2,000 schools across the country. They'd raised nearly $1 million through grants, corporate partnerships, and individual donations. More importantly, they'd fed hundreds of thousands of students who might otherwise have gone hungry. But that morning, Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't thinking about the big numbers or the organizational success. She was thinking about Tommy. He was in 4th grade now in Mrs. Patterson's class down the hall. Mrs. Rodriguez still saw him around school, still said hello, still checked in on how he was doing. And what she'd noticed over the past year had filled her heart with something she could only describe as quiet joy. Tommy was thriving. His grades had improved dramatically. He'd joined the school's reading club. He smiled more, talked more, had friends he ate lunch with. He was still the same gentle, thoughtful kid he'd always been. But now there was a lightness to him that hadn't been there before. The weight of constant hunger had lifted, and he could just be a kid. His grandmother had gotten a better job, one with more regular hours and decent pay. The family had finally been approved for the free lunch program, which helped tremendously. But even on days when Tommy had a full lunch from home, Mrs. Rodriguez would sometimes see him grab something from the snack station in Mrs. Patterson's room. Not because he was hungry, she suspected, but because it was there, because he could, because he no longer had to worry about where his next meal would come from. That kind of security, that kind of stability, it changed a child. Mrs. Rodriguez had watched it happen not just with Tommy, but with dozens of other students over the past year. Lily, the girl who used to claim she'd eaten a big breakfast, was now one of the top students in her grade. Kevin had stopped stuffing napkins in his pockets and had started playing soccer at recess. Rachel, who'd been eating leftovers off other kids' trays, was now in the school choir and had a voice that could make you stop and listen. These kids hadn't needed rescuing. They just needed support, needed someone to notice they were struggling and help remove one barrier that was keeping them from reaching their potential. Once that happened, once they didn't have to spend their energy worrying about food, they could focus on everything else, learning, growing, becoming who they were meant to be. Mrs. Rodriguez had learned a lot over the past year. She'd learned about nonprofit management and fundraising and public speaking. She'd learned how to talk to reporters and how to write grant applications. She'd learned that change was possible, that one person really could make a difference. But the most important thing she'd learned was something simpler, something she should have known all along. People want to help. They want to be part of something good. They just need to know how, need to see a path forward, need someone to show them that their contribution matters. Every donation that came in, whether it was $5 or $5,000, came with a story. A grandmother who'd grown up poor and never forgotten what hunger felt like. A businessman who'd built a successful company but remembered being a hungry kid himself. A teenager who'd saved up allowance money because she thought every kid should have snacks at school. These weren't charity cases or tax write-offs to these people. They were personal investments in a future where children didn't have to be hungry. They were ways of saying, I see this problem and I want to be part of the solution. Mrs. Rodriguez had been invited to the White House that spring for an education summit. She'd sat in a room with policymakers and education reformers, and they'd talked about child hunger as a national issue. People used phrases like food insecurity and socioeconomic factors and systemic poverty. All of those things were true and important. But Mrs. Rodriguez kept bringing the conversation back to something more immediate, more tangible. There was a child sitting in a classroom somewhere right now who was hungry. Today. Not as a statistic or a policy issue, but as a real kid with a real empty stomach. What were they going to do about that child today? Some of the policymakers seemed frustrated by her insistence on the immediate and personal. They wanted to talk about long-term solutions, about addressing root causes, and those things mattered, absolutely. But Mrs. Rodriguez had learned that you could do both. You could work on systemic change while also making sure kids had food today. One didn't cancel out the other. Back at Lincoln Elementary, the impact of the food program went beyond just feeding hungry students. Something else had happened, something Mrs. Rodriguez hadn't anticipated. The school community had become closer, more connected. Parents who'd never been involved before started volunteering to stock the food stations. Local businesses that had never partnered with the school before started donating. Students learned about compassion and community care in ways that no lesson plan could have taught them. Mrs. Rodriguez's own students, her current third graders, had asked if they could do a food drive for the snack stations. They'd made posters, announced it at assembly, and collected donations from their families. One little girl brought in a box of granola bars and explained that her mom had bought them special because she wanted to help kids who needed snacks. The students didn't see it as charity. They saw it as taking care of each other, and that perspective, that understanding that we're all responsible for each other's well-being, that was maybe the most important lesson Mrs. Rodriguez had ever taught. One afternoon in late spring, Mrs. Rodriguez was restocking the classroom snack station when someone knocked on her door. She turned to find Tommy standing there, now several inches taller than he'd been a year ago. "Hi, Tommy. What can I do for you?" "Mrs. Rodriguez, I wanted to show you something." He pulled out a piece of paper from his backpack. It was an essay he'd written for Mrs. Patterson's class about someone who'd inspired him. He'd written about Mrs. Rodriguez, about how she'd noticed he was hungry and helped him, without making him feel bad about it. About how the snack closet had made him feel safe and cared for. About how he wanted to be a teacher when he grew up, so he could help kids the way she'd helped him.